Hello, and welcome to this webinar on workplace diversity, the why and the how. My name is Pancham Dogra, and I am part of the Times Ascent team. And today we have two eminent panelists with us to make sure that we learn a lot from their experience. The first panelist that we have today with us is Anupam Trehan, who is Director of People and Communities in Cisco India and SARC. Well, Anupam leads HR for Cisco in India and SARC and works with senior leaders and their leadership teams to build integrated talent and people strategies with specific focus on strategic workforce planning, leadership development, coaching, talent management, and to make sure that she provides the HR expertise in the areas of employee relations, development, conflict management, OD, and more. In fact, Anupam has been with Cisco for more than a decade, and she has taken different roles. In fact, she was the HR leader for engineering organization in India. She was also the customer experience organization leader for APAC, Japan, and Greater China. And in fact, before Cisco, uh, Anupam worked with companies like JP Morgan, Delphi Technical Centers, and Tata Autocom in various functions in HR. In fact, Anupam describes herself as a mother, traveler, and reader who's slowly getting back to her first love, writing. And we would love to see more writing from her. Maybe you can write for Ascent also. Yeah. Anupam, if you could just quickly share your screen and wave to the audience, at least people would know that where I'm talking to you. You can just say hi to them before I introduce Sneha.
Hi everyone, I'm really glad to join you today. Glad to be here.
Thank you, Anupam. Well, our second panelist is Sneha Arora, who is a recognized HR professional with experience across technology, retail, and e-commerce industries. In her current role as Vice President Human Capital at Myntra, she provides leadership for the human capital function and partners with the leadership team in building a people-first culture. In her prior role at SAP as Director Human Resources, she was the HRBP leader for key technology teams in India, with an additional responsibility as the regional, which is Asia Pacific in Japan HRBP. Well, Sneha has been adept at working in fast-paced, diverse, and multicultural environment, and she has extensively worked towards driving large-scale organization change initiatives, influencing across levels and geographies, developing, partnering with leaders for delivering results. She also has a strong track record of conceptualizing and implementing talent engagement, organization development, and leadership programs and initiatives. In fact, the external world has also recognized Neha's achievements, and she was recognized by People Matters, which is a leading HR publication as emerging HR leader in 2017, and by CII as a rising star in HR in 2018. She also received the Women HR Leadership Award by Observe Now. Well, with two heavyweight panelists, I think it's going to be an interesting conversation on the subject of diversity, which most of us actually have been talking a lot about. At the same time, I think this is one topic which, even if the whole world is talking about, a couple of questions that continue to pop up repeatedly. Are diversity initiatives working? And majority of the answers that you research actually tell you that diversity initiatives are taking shape, but slowly. In fact, incidentally, McKinsey has been writing a lot about it, and they actually published a series of papers. They started with winning with diversity, diversity matters, and now diversity wins. And as early as latest as 2020, after the COVID, when they published one of the reports, they actually published very interesting insights that in the last 5 years, not much had changed. While there was some needle movement in terms of diversity and inclusion practices across the organizations, but even then, there were few organizations that were doing a great job, and others actually who were not doing as great a job. And then they tried to understand as to why this was happening. And they figured that one of the challenges has been, how do you measure diversity? And that also brought us to the question as to why should we talk about diversity in a country like India? For example, when we were in school, we used to read something like, in India, they say, "Kos kos pe badle pani, chai kos pe bani." In English means that after every mile, the taste of water changes in India, and every 1.5 or 2.5 miles, the language changes. That's how diverse India is as a culture. And therefore, why should we talk about workplace diversity when we are brought up in such diverse environments from our early childhood? The actually answer to that lies in some of the interesting insights that we will find. And one of the same McKinsey report that I'm talking about, they also talked about the fact that in India, out of 100 organizations, only 28 organizations were such where there was at least one woman leader in the executive team, and overall women representation in the executive team is not more than 5%. Now compare this with a country like Norway, which is actually the leader. 100% of the organizations there had at least one woman leader in the executive team, and around 48% people, women, actually have found representation in leadership teams. So that's how stark the difference is. And therefore, what I wanted to talk to you about, the panelist, and I will actually start the first question that I'm directing to Anupam. So Anupam, in your opinion, why is the situation in India the way it is that I just described?
So, Pancham, I think a couple of things, right? So, is India a very, very diverse country? Absolutely, yes. Absolutely with you on that. But do we also have this reality where we have underrepresented communities within the country? Yes. Again, I think what ends up happening, and especially when you start to look at it from a workplace perspective, right? One of the challenges that you will always hit is when you are trying to build a workplace that is diverse and inclusive, we sometimes forget the societal aspect of it, right? Which is there are norms, there are biases, there are beliefs, and that whole balance around how do you try to build a culture of inclusion and diversity that's not only restricted from a workplace perspective, but is also something that is probably a little broader than from an org perspective. I think that's number one. I think number two, a lot of times we start on this journey of diverse representation in the workforce, but what we sometimes fail to understand is that in order to have a diverse representation, it's not enough just to hire, but you also have to create an environment where that employee can actually flourish in their career. And for different people, that could mean different things. So the ability to also hear from the ground what is the realities, what is the kind of support that they need, and to have those inclusive policies and cultures. So I think that is one. I would say the last one is the one that probably plays the biggest role, which all of us know plays the biggest role, but still sometimes is undermined, is just bias. And a lot of times we call it unconscious bias. I would say it's conscious and unconscious both, but bias plays up in many, many different ways. It could play up in the way that you hire talent. It could play up in the way that you assess talent. It shows up in many, many different ways. And I think this is not an easy one to solve. There is no quick fix solution. There is no regular playbook or a cookie cutter approach that will work for all. And I think that's what makes it difficult, because this is not an easy topic to solve for. And everybody's looking for quick solutions. Let me learn from you. If it's worked for you, let me try and see if it works for me. And that may not always be true. So I think those are a few things that make this a challenging topic to address. But I think the flip side of that coin is it also points us to a whole lot of opportunities that we have from an organization perspective to start to look at this from a very, very different lens, to start from a lens of inclusion first versus from a lens of diversity first. And I think that would bring a lot of difference.
Well, thanks a lot, Anupam. It was actually, you brought up very interesting points around biasing and unbiasing, which we will certainly talk about as we go along. Now, before we move to the next question, which comes from the question that you asked, and we will also start involving the audience now. Neha, quick thoughts on the question that we talked about, and what you think of what Anupam also talked about as to why the current state of diversity, and what can we do about it?
Well, I think I'll take a bit of an optimistic view as well. I think there is a much larger awareness today. I mean, if I compare, let's say, a decade back, right, in terms of the kind of conversations which are happening, most organizations, they understand the value of inclusion and how can it benefit from an innovation standpoint, how can it benefit from a financial standpoint as well, with the kind of studies and research which is happening today as well. And even let's say if I take the example of IT in India, right? I mean, women now make up 34% of the IT workforce in India, and most of these workers are under the age of 30. So from a youth perspective of Indian IT labor force, we have significantly powered from a growth standpoint, and the country is now almost at 50-50 gender parity rate, at least in STEM graduates. And I think, again, building on what Anupam said earlier, that there's also investment in terms of policies, infrastructure, and even culture by most organizations, where inclusion is a topic which is often at least spoken about, right? And there's intent there as well. I think what hinders today are three things, right? I mean, one, unconscious biases, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about as we go forward. And Anupam brought this point up earlier as well. I think the second point is women itself as well in some ways, right? I mean, one, there's a clear lack of role models, very few women at the top, which doesn't make it easier. Second, I think there's this entire self-limiting behaviors as well, where women don't ask for what they want, and they're, in fact, research says that they're less likely to apply for roles as well if they don't meet every criteria which is listed out. And then, there's also a lot of research which says women are over-mentored today, but it's harder than men for them to find sponsor organically, where people who really help them land that next assignment or role. I think the third part is around the deeper societal context, right? When it comes to women, or even taking a broader view from an inclusion standpoint, when it comes to LGBT inclusion as well, let's say, right? I mean, where basic understanding and acceptance is also an issue. So even from a legal standpoint, right, we are fairly behind there. It's just been 2 years since we abolished Section 377, and we are yet to make any progress. So I think, to my mind, these are the pieces: the unconscious bias part of it, the entire self-limiting behaviors and beliefs part of it when it comes to women themselves, and these deeper societal contexts which really holds us back from making progress, would be my view.
Great, thank you. Actually, interestingly, our conversation so far has centered about gender diversity. So what I wanted to do at this stage, and this is a very specific reason why actually I wanted to discuss this, I want to actually quickly look at how other organizations are also looking at diversity. And for this, I wanted our participants to actually help us answer some of these questions. And the first question is, now, participants, this is an opportunity for you to go and actually help us find answers to some of these questions. The question is on www.menti.com. So my request to you, either use your computer or your phone and go to www.menti.com. Enter the meeting code 7783275, and by the time you do that, I'm just going to go back to Menti, and then we will look at your results live. I can see answers already. So the question that I'm asking is, which of the following types of diversity does your organization measure and report? Gender, ethnicity, educational background, socio-economic background, diversity of thought. And so far, of course, we have people responding. So let's see how some of these questions come up. Okay, interesting. People are still trickling in and giving their insights, but so far it does appear that the diversity being measured, majority of it is centered around gender, to some extent ethnicity and educational background, but it will be interesting to know how they use this information also. So interesting. So we'll just wait for another minute before we move on, so I can continue to see that gender and ethnicity and gender, of course, is miles ahead. So more or less, it's coming to this. So in fact, we have already started getting some questions also, and most of the questions are around gender diversity, and of course we'll continue to ask you these questions as we go along, which are more about very specific aspects of how people can take concrete steps. But before we get down to that, I think it will be interesting to look at what these results say. That yes, at the moment, I think the whole world is focused on gender and ethnicity diversity, and therefore the question is there opportunity for us to expand the definition of diversity, or do we believe that at this time maybe to start on these two is adequate, because we are yet to make much more progress on the subject? So Anupam, what's your thought on this?
I was quite interested to see diversity of thought, because for me, I think that's a given. Regardless of whoever, like you could have two women, but diversity of thought still comes in. And even though you may keep them together from a gender perspective, they are still very, very different and very, very diverse. It was interesting to see how, the feedback, even on diversity of thought. I would probably give a lens, from where I'm working. So obviously, yes, do we focus on gender? Do we focus on ethnicity? Absolutely, yes. But we're also looking at a lot of the different communities that require support. So be it LGBTQIA, be it WEDs, be it any other specific groups or communities that need support, and what is it that we can do to help. So for example, in the US, more recently when the whole Black Lives Matter kicked off in a big way, Cisco took a stance in support of what was happening, and we made very, very clearly a stance on what's going to be Cisco's stance with African American Black population. So I think for us, the way that we're looking at it is not just from a gender or an ethnicity perspective. I would say that for us, that lens is a little broader in terms of what are those communities, what is it that we can do as an organization? Because for us, it's two things, not just what can we do from an organization, but what can we do also to affect societal change. So I think that's what I would call out.
Interesting. Cool. Thanks, Anupam. So now, in fact, the next question I'm directing to Sneha. Now I'm coming to the brass tacks a bit. That you're right, that we need to expand the definition of diversity. At the same time, I think there is merit in also making sure that whatever steps we have started, we need to see them through. And unless we start doing that, then it is we may have a very broad definition, but we may not have anything to show for it, which of course we all know is not going to work. And in fact, there are some questions that have actually come up. So Sneha, I'm going to throw one question from Kumari R. And her question is, how can we embed diversity into the firm successfully? Here, what I would request you to do, Sneha, is to maybe talk about one or two unique initiatives that Myntra you've started, or maybe in some other organizations that you've started, that you believe are giving you dividends, because that's what people will benefit from.
Sure. So I think what can we do to embed? Let me talk a little bit about that, and then I'll go to specific initiatives as well. I think for when I sort of think about it, I think one of the things which is sort of a mandate is also that leaders have a huge role to play, right? And the tone really has to be set from the top. And I think that's the one which needs to be sort of the first step when we start thinking about it. And then there are 3 A's that leaders can use as an approach, which is around awareness, advocacy, and action, right? And to me, I think the day-to-day decisions of managers is what finally builds the culture at the workplace, right? They play a very, very significant role, for example, in building an inclusive culture. Simple things. How are you running your meetings? Are you making people comfortable to speak up? which viewpoints are heard, go a long way in making sure that people are feeling included and valued, right? I mean, ultimately in our setup, diversity is a given. We have many ethnicities, we have people talking different languages, we have different genders, we have different abilities, we have different ethnicities. Ultimately, it does come down to inclusion and how valued can someone feel. So I think one of the things that we are very consciously trying to do is include managers in this narrative. We have one of our leaders who's a DNI sponsor for us. We've also created a lot of content such as Leading with Empathy, which is again around inclusion. We've done these workshops. We've created manager handbooks as well for managers of employees who are undergoing parenthood journeys. Some of these initiatives have been done with the intent of driving this change in the manager behavior, so that ultimately an employee on the ground feels included in the way the organization interacts with them. I think specific initiatives, again, we have done things around policy. Let me go to the LGBT inclusion part of it. We've extended medical insurance to same-sex partners. We've also included gender affirmation surgery for an LGBTQIA population, and we've also looked at what I was mentioning earlier in terms of the inclusion content and also addressing the unconscious bias. We've created these small modules which can then go to everyone, and that again changes the behavior, and that's what ultimately we feel will help us give dividends. On the specific, when it comes to gender inclusion, we've done various things again from a policy standpoint as well. We launched a Motherhood and Beyond program last year, which is again helping women and enabling them through the journey of motherhood, right from the point wherein they share with us that they are on this journey. And we've also extended our paternity leave to make sure we are supporting our new fathers also. I think that's the piece which kind of gets overlooked at times. So I think some of these measures around policies is what we have taken up, which are giving us a good response and good dividends as well. I feel that the journey is longer, especially when it comes to the unconscious bias part of it, because again, this is something which influences all the decisions, the day-to-day things that managers do and day-to-day things that we do as an organization, right? I'll share an interesting statistic with you, which is that we receive 11 million bits of information every second, and we can consciously only process 40 bits. So for 99.9999996% of the time, we are in the state of unconscious bias. So this is a difficult one for us. We've sort of started to make measures around how do you make people more aware of, how they are thinking about things. But I think this is a journey, and this is going to take us longer. And that's the attempt as well.
Great. Well, thanks, Sneha. So Anupam, I saw that when Sneha talked about unconscious bias and bits of information, so I saw your smile became very broad and you started nodding. So it will be interesting to get your take on bias, of course. And we know that bias and diversity initiatives, they actually are enemies of each other. And unless you tackle one, you can't move to the other. So it will be interesting for us to know. Of course, Neha has talked about two broad areas. One is manager capability development, and the second is policies to support some of the initiatives we are talking about. So it will be useful for us to know from you what you have done at Cisco, and maybe before that, to promote diversity and a culture of inclusivity or equality at work.
Absolutely. So I would say just, a plus one to what Sneha has mentioned specifically from a policy and a people leader awareness, because I think those are, you just have to do them. I'll probably, speak about a couple of other initiatives that we have done at Cisco. Around 2 years back, we decided to modify our traditional hiring process, right? So traditionally, from a hiring process, you have a job, you post it, you get applications, you go through the resume, you shortlist, right? And what we realized is that there ends up still being a lot of bias that comes in the entire talent acquisition process, right? From, when you look at a resume to the interview, like there are pieces where bias actually steps in. So what we actually did, we implemented a skill-based assessment versus a resume-based assessment. So what that meant was, we actually, because if you are hiring software engineers, you need to assess them on their coding skills and not necessarily where they worked, etc. So what we did is we actually started with a scale-based assessment, and we eliminated resumes from the interview process. And that itself resulted in a massive difference from a diversity standpoint. And when I say massive difference from a diversity standpoint, it wasn't only from a gender perspective, but it was different. It affected us positively with respect to diversity in experiences and backgrounds. I still remember when we were sharing this with some of our business leaders, like some of them were saying, had we actually looked at some of these profiles, we would have rejected them, right? But without a resume to create that bias, they were fantastic employees for us. We saw diversity in hiring from across the country. Otherwise earlier we would be like, okay, I think this talent is going to be available here. So we saw just eliminating resumes from the interview process play a very, very positive impact in diversity. The other one for us that has been playing a huge role for us in this space is also our employee resource organizations or network organizations. So at Cisco, we've got around 12 network organizations. We have, we've got Women of Cisco, we have CDAN, which is our Disability Awareness Network, we've got Pride for our LGBTQ, so we have all of those. But we've also tried to create employee networks based on feedback that we've received from our employees. So for example, we have an employee resource network, special children's group, and this is targeted for parents who've got children with special needs, because this helps them come together as a community. It allows us as an organization to hear from them and support them, both in terms of policies, both in terms of connecting them with experts, etc. We've got Back to Business, which is aimed at people who are coming back from a break. And that could be people who've gone on maternity leave, that could be people who've gone on a break for elder care, that could be people who've just taken a break for any reason. So we've got Back to Business, which is focused on helping people get back on their careers after they've taken a break. We've got a network for cancer support, both in terms of if you yourself are recovering from the illness or if you're a caregiver. So what I would say is that for us, what we have seen is our ERO and networks have played such a key role in creating that environment of inclusion. And they also help us keep a pulse on the ground. They always tell us what the requirement is, how is it that we can help? And so there's this very active partnership, which helps us create a very, very diverse and inclusive workplace.
Wow, amazing. So in fact, thank you, Anupam. In fact, between Anupam and Sneha, I think, in fact, there were questions around this from Kumari, R, and Arpita. So hopefully, Arpita and Kumari, you would have got quite a bit of actionable intelligence that you can actually start using in your organizations to kickstart diversity initiatives if you have not already done. And in fact, the question, the recruitment example, Anupam, that you talked about actually is a brilliant example, which also I can use to my advantage to transition to the measurement piece of diversity, because most of the times we talk about diversity, inclusion, we talk about activities. But I think one of the biggest measures of success has to be how does it impact my top line, my bottom line, or some other initiatives that I am actually tracking at a strategic level. And before we come to Sneha and from you, I want to now understand from audiences once more, and we'll invite them again to go back to Menti and take the next question in the poll. This is more about the metrics around diversity, and then we will come back to both of you to look at what you think of what the people are saying. At the same time, what can we do? So I'm just going to quickly share my screen so that. So audience, I would request you to move to the next question and answer this. Can you see my screen? Sneha, Anupam, can you see the next poll?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Okay, great. So audience, again, in fact, if you did not log out from Menti, you could continue on the next slide. The poll should be live on your mobiles or computers. If you have moved out, request you to move back in. Menti.com code is 7783275. Okay, interesting. So for those of us who, for example, are taking some time in and trying to make sense of what we are talking about, I'm just going to help you a bit to maybe decipher this. See, the first question simply says, what kind of recruitment gender diversity matrix are we using? Here, what we are talking about is your overall recruitment funnel and how your ratio of applicants in terms of male, female, and any other gender that you're talking about, from the ratio of applicants to a simple job to how many shortlists of that and how many select as an overall proportion of your gender. Let's say if at your workplace you have 40% females and 60% male, then is that the kind of ratio that you have been able to maintain in your recruitment funnel? Is it better? Is it worse? That's one. Similarly, pay difference by gender for the same role, because we always say that compensation metric should be based on the role and the skill and not on gender. The question is how true it is in your organization. Do you actually consciously measure it? That's the question. The other one that we want to talk about is percentage of people by gender at each level. Again, this is more or less in terms of cohorts. How are their distribution and how is their attrition looking like? Is the attrition in terms of overall fraction of the population the same? Or is it that a certain gender, for example, exists more as an overall fraction of the population? And the third and fourth actually become more interesting and slightly more advancements rate. So let's say if there are, for example, 30% of females at a particular level, to what extent of these people, for example, is the promotion rate also commensurate with 30% people moving up? Or is it that there are more men who move up versus females, or vice versa? Yeah. So is your advancement rate also, for example, commensurate with your gender diversity rate or not? And the last one is representation, because this is actually a difficult one. The question here is, to what extent you are growing your female leaders into administrative role versus staff role? So that means people who are growing, are you putting a glass ceiling for line roles for some of these female candidates? Or are you actually really promoting them to do meaningful line roles as well? That's the question. And this is one of the toughest ones. I do understand that. Having said that, it will be interesting to see what you have to say about some of these things. So far, it does appear to us that the last one is not being measured, or even if it is measured, chances are it's not something that is very common, let's put it this way. Advancement rate and percentage of people at each level and the retention rate. So in terms of different diversity cohorts also, it's not happening. But yes, we are certainly monitoring it at recruitment funnel level. That's what it occurs to me so far. So Anupam and Sneha, looking at this information, what is the first thought that comes to your mind?
Neha, do you want to go first?
Sure, I can go first. I think some of this is honestly expected. I think most of the industry metrics sort of revolves around the funnel part of it, the intake part of it, women percentages across the board, different levels, women in leadership, women in workforce, attrition metrics. I think some of these are standard. I'm happy to see the pay difference part of it picking up as well. I think this is an important one too, where it's required that we keep a track on the processes which are happening in the organization, and that's a good indicator of the unconscious bias in the system as well. If the promotion velocities are different, let's say, or there's a gap in pay which is unexplained, right? I mean, if it's explained basis performance differentials, whatever, you can still make sense out of it. But if it's unexplained, then that's something to keep an eye on, because that's a good indicator of unconscious biases which may be existing in the system but may not, of course, not visible, right? So I think that's how I'm kind of looking at it from a data standpoint. I think for me, there are a couple of things, right? I mean, one, there are, of course, these metrics which are lag metrics: women in workforce, women in management, women in leadership, attrition, right? Because they are a function of, you analyze them post facto, that okay, it's already happened, right? And then there are the lead metrics, how much, what's the intake that we are looking at. And I think in addition for us, we also measure the pulse on an ongoing basis, engagement survey demographic cuts. So when we are looking at this amber, it gives us a mood score, and we look at it both ways, that what's the overall score, whereas what is the mood score as well. So that's a bit of a lead metric in terms of a little bit of a prediction of attrition, let's say, that how are we doing things. And every process of ours follows an analysis where we are very keenly looking at demographic variations as well, whether it's performance management, especially on performance velocities part of it, or its compensation. We are very vigilant about it. I think what is missing today, is when I look at industry in general, I think organizations need to show more ownership and transparency. For example, in Silicon Valley, you typically see that diversity scorecards are very transparently shared with everyone. So I think that sense of transparency is something that it's important. And I think my view is also that, look, it's a topic where we need to go beyond metrics, right? I think how psychologically safe a work environment is, what are the enablers and challenges, which is sometimes a qualitative conversation, right? So there needs to be some comfort with that too, rather than always chasing numbers and metrics. It is about inclusion at the end of the day, and there are things which are going to be qualitative, which cannot be measured. I think also coming to connecting it back with business metrics, right? I think again, from our business standpoint specifically, right? It's extremely important that we have the diverse workforce, which is reflective of diversity in our customer base as well. For example, our customer base is woman heavy also, given the nature of the business that we are in. So that's sort of the attempt from a business point of view, and it makes sense for us. And ultimately, I think it's about a mix of voices, right? The discussion where we started in terms of a diverse mix of voices, which will lead to better discussion, decision, and outcome, whether it's for customers, whether it's for stakeholders, and whether it's for the organization or people in the organization itself. So that's sort of the attempt, and yeah, I mean, sometimes those direct linkages may exist, sometimes they may not exist, but I think it's an important topic, irrespective of whether there is a hard metric to chase or not.
Great. Thanks, Neha. Anupam, your views on the findings, and it will also be interesting for us to know what metrics you use to track and measure diversity and how it is impacting your workplace.
So I think just a couple of quick reactions to what we just saw in the poll. So the first and foremost, I would have thought that the feedback on the question around representation by grade and retention by the level would have been higher. So I was a little surprised to see that lower down. But honestly, I wasn't surprised to see recruitment being the primary one and then lower scores for the others. And I think that also speaks to the problem statement, which is every time we speak about diversity, it always becomes a hiring initiative or a hiring effort, and not as much that is thought about. So what do we do once we have that diverse employee on board? And I think the metrics that were put out there and the scores that we got along that actually speaks to the focus that is then there for the organization. And I think what organizations need to start to do is balance some of those metrics out as well, depending on their level of maturity, how early in the journey are they in their IND journey as well. Focusing on recruiting does not necessarily mean that you will be able to sustain a diverse representation in your workforce. So I think that is very, very important. I think I'm with Sneha when she said that this is not just about metrics, it's a lot more. Because based on the metrics that you have, like I say, sometimes they're a rear view indicator, sometimes they help guide you. For us at Cisco, obviously, a couple of things that we've done is not just in terms of pay parity, but we're also looking at it in terms of reward fairness. So for example, progression through the grade levels, progression across jobs, across internal movement, etc. So we are also looking at how is it that we can help some of that. We have inbuilt unconscious bias, I would say awareness, I won't even call it training, across a lot of our key processes so that people are very, very aware of the same as they're making certain decisions. There's a huge opportunity, and Sneha spoke about this with managers and with people leaders, because a lot of the decisions are driven by them. So be it whether I want to hire the person, be it whether I want to promote the person, be it with respect to how much salary increase I need to give. And I'm sure for a lot of people who are listening in, like these are questions that come, like if you're a manager, then these are questions that you have, and if you're in HR, these are questions that you will hear, which is, okay, so and so was on maternity leave, but should I give them a salary increase? Should I pay them bonus? Should I promote them? Or it could be something from a hiring perspective, right? So you always see this, and how can we start to play a different role around coaching, guiding? Because honestly, those are examples for me where bias comes in, right? And I think for us in the function, the focus always has to be what is the solution. And the solution sometimes may not always be a policy or a program, and sometimes it may be something different. So I think also for us in the function to think differently on what would be the solutions is something that I would call out.
That's a great point. Sorry, Pancham, I'm building on that. I think that's a great point. It is a lot about the day-to-day pieces, and the answer cannot always lie in processes and policies, right? I mean, while there are guardrails, ultimately we have to equip people to make the right decisions, right? And there's not every decision that you will be able to monitor, or every decision that people will even come and ask you a question. So how do you build that sense of awareness from within the system? And I think technology can be a great enabler as well in that, right? I mean, at the point where somebody is making a decision, if you can get a nudge to say that, look, I see you rated this person this, or you're not promoting a person where the past ratings have been great, have been 4 or whatever the system is. So past ratings are great, but you're still not putting this person up for promotion. Do you want to reconsider? So I think technology can play a great role as well. Unfortunately, I think in HR we tend to lag behind when it comes to technology from a system standpoint, but I think there's a lot of potential there as well, where a real-time nudge coming in at the point of decision making can really help drive this awareness at scale, while we build that ecosystem wherein we are providing that sense of awareness through programs, creating guardrails through policies. But I think the technology can play a big role in this as well, as we go forward.
Sure. Oh, thanks a lot, Anupam. Thanks a lot, Sneha. So what I hear you say is that when you look at concept like diversity, so there are two elements that we have to keep in mind. One is that diversity is much more beyond metrics. So it is maybe the way we work, the way we think, the way we live our organizational lives as we go along. That's one. And the second thing, of course, I think if you have to make sure that there are tangible focuses that you want to look at and show that there is a needed movement. For example, if your performance overall per person productivity is improved because of the fact that your recruitment process becomes blind to any gender bias, so then there is a direct correlation. Or in fact, I am extending it to things that let's say talent management, we conduct talent reviews. If we actually start conducting blind talent reviews, minus the name or the gender, only looking at the achieved accomplishments of the person, and then when you start choosing and when you start realizing that you are actually able to choose the best candidate for the job instead of the man or a woman for the job, then chances are then we know that we are actually putting our best feet forward in terms of where it is. When we start thinking of talent as money and source of competitive advantage, we do the exact thing with, we don't say it's 5 rupee note, therefore I'll treat it differently, or if it's a 50 paisa coin, I'll treat it differently. It's the value of the money that is more important than in what form it exists, or for that matter, a digital world. Same thing should happen with talent. It should be what it can do for us rather than in what shape and form it exists. And if we are able to get some metrics to start asking some of these questions to people, chances are we will be able to uncover many biases, and then we can tackle it. And at the same time, this also gives us maybe impetus to some specific programs that we can actually help, which will over a period of time help us see direct correlation between diversity initiatives and company profitability and growth. In fact, this is interesting. The reason I wanted to summarize it like this is because Supriya Malhotra asked this question: what should be the new talent management interventions to improve diversity? So some, of course, you've already talked about this talent review, blind talent review, an idea that actually came to me basis what you talked about recruitment. So I said, talent review is nothing but assessment of talent. So you take that idea from recruitment and apply it in talent reviews, and you are able to do this only also after people come back. So that's what I thought about. And since we've been talking about biases a lot, this is also a good opportunity for us to now move to the third element of diversity and biases. So we all know that every human being will have some kind of bias. But I think the question that we have to ask ourselves is, how do we ensure that my own biases don't come in the way of making right decisions? And in fact, before the conversation, before this seminar, webinar, COVID conversation, when we were chatting, I said that I wanted to ask this question about how remote working is going to impact the way your diversity initiatives will actually pan out. So this is the time where I want to do that. Why? Because we talked about the fact that, see, earlier we had people coming to office. They would spend majority of their awake time either commuting to work and from work or at work. So that means more than 12 hours approximately people would be thinking about work or talking about work to workplace colleague. In the new environment, while you may be thinking and talking to people sporadically, the fact is that you have more external influence from household, because you're interacting with most of your household members than your office people, or at least in the physical proximity and also the ambience point of view. Therefore, earlier the kind of push messages that from diversity point of view that as an organization we could give to them now have to undergo a change. So have you, for example, thought of it in your programs? And if yes, it will be useful for the participants to get the benefit of your wisdom in terms of how you've been able to do it and what has changed because of that. So Anupam, this time maybe I'll start with you and then come to Sneha.
Sure. So when we first went to work from home, right, when the pandemic hit, and we actually decided to go from, we decided to go work from home even before the lockdown in the country started. One of the things that worked for us as an organization globally was this realization, because we went work from home globally. So all 75,000 employees across 172 countries went work from home globally. There was this huge emphasis right from our CEO and our executive leadership team around the need for empathy and understanding. So we had these global weekly check-ins with our CEO and our executive leadership team that was opened up for all employees. And in that, the ask was put forward not just to people leaders, but to each one of us as individual employees as well, saying be empathetic, be understanding, because the reality is now, like you said, Pancham, has changed for all of us, right? We're all working from home. Some of us may have dedicated home offices, some of us don't. Kids come in, parents come in. And for us, it was around, we know it's difficult. We know everybody's trying to balance. So and we actually gave examples saying, if you have a meeting and somebody's child wants attention, please pay attention to your child, leave the meeting, right? And I was having some of those messages being posted right from the top, I think made a lot of difference. I think what we also saw was, as everybody went to work from home, the ground realities, like everybody had some point of similarity. So everybody was able to empathize a lot more with the other. So, honestly, it's not uncommon for us whenever we are having our internal meetings to have your kids walking. So sometimes somebody have their child on their lap, or somebody have their pet walking all around, or somebody's parents coming from the back and saying, do you want chai, or pressure cooker whistles going on. So for us, it's a way of life, right? So none of us react to that. So I think that was one. The other one that we did as well was one is, of course, we asked our people leaders to step in and play that role in creating that inclusive culture for us. But we also leveraged our employee resource organizations a lot to actually touch base with our diverse communities across to see what is it that we can do, how is it that we can support them. And based on what they asked, in some cases, people said, hey, we need like an expert to come in and talk to. So we kind of got experts, either medical experts or other experts from different areas, to have sessions with our employees and speak to them, right? So we tried to do different pieces. I can't really call them a program or an intervention, but I think the whole focus was, how do we make this comfortable for you, knowing that it's not even, everybody calls this working from home. But the reality today is we're all working through a pandemic. and you're trying to balance work, you're trying to balance life, and at the same time, you're trying to balance your concerns from a health and safety and well-being perspective for yourself, for your family, for your loved ones, right? So it's not an easy situation for everybody. So I think for us, the key thing was how do we all lead with understanding, and I think that's made a huge difference for us.
Interesting. Okay, that actually is interesting because you actually had to improvise real time almost to look at how, for example, you would be able to continue some of these initiatives. Okay, interesting. Sneha, any maybe one or two initiatives that your organization, because your organization actually had two different sets that we were talking about. One would have got impacted very adversely early on, and the other set would be relatively less impacted from the pandemic. So how did you, for example, look at changing your?
I think I would build on what Anupam said, right? I mean, it's been about empathy and understanding what are the kind of challenges that people are facing, no matter which roles that you're in, right? I mean, there were roles which cannot be done from home, right? I mean, a delivery person cannot be at home. We had to, they have to be on the ground. People have to run operations at the end of the day. There are different set of challenges where safety was of course the first concern. Customers might, on top of customers' mind as well, safety has been the first factor. You want to be assured that the entire supply chain your product is coming through is safe. And similarly, from an employee standpoint, that's the first thing that comes to top of anybody's mind. So we took various measures on the safety front to make sure that our facilities are safe. Whether it's about installing partition between work desks, whether it's making sure that anybody who's even boarding the bus is first checked for all the temperature is checked, masks are provided, sanitizers are provided. So basic sanitization of facilities. So I think we did the whole thing in terms of making sure that we are running a supply chain which is safe for our customers as well as our employees. And again, different measures, right? We also extended medical insurance to our partners. So there are these Kirana stores that we work with. 70% of our last mile deliveries happens through Kirana stores. So extending insurance to those partners, to our blue collar workers as well, to make sure they get a sense of that they have something to fall back on. I think again, for remote working for us was a very different ballgame, right? Because we have this culture where people would get into a meeting room, decide something, we move on from there, we move fast, and we are all located pretty much at the same location. So it's easier to just grab a load of people, get into a room, decide something, and move on from there. So it was a big change where suddenly everybody's working remotely, right? So 3-4 days it took for people to understand that you have to mute yourself before you're talking, but we could quickly get into that rhythm. And I think again, from a challenges standpoint, there have been various, and different people have had different issues as well, right? So for example, for parents, it's been a hard time managing kids at home, where school starts at a certain time. You've got to log the child into the class. Then there are exams which are happening, and then there are other challenges as well, from cooks not being there, maids not being there, and we are so dependent as well, right, on some of these things that are provided. So we have done things, and work life has been a major sort of challenge for us in that sense. And we've tried things like we did meetings Wednesday to make sure people are getting sort of one day in the week wherein they can just think. They don't have to get into any meetings, and it is their work time as such. We have given various recharge, refresh leaves, because after heavy sale events for us, it was important that we're giving people time to really, just spend time with the family and not work. We started work norms. We said that we're not going to work outside of 10 to 7 in terms of meetings. So we've tried these different things, and then when we heard that look, infrastructure is a problem at home, and similarly for people on the ground, that how can you support me better? We also we launched a benefit mantra for you, wherein you could buy a COVID test for yourself, family. You could buy a desk, table, whatever, right? So that which can help people really settle down from a work environment standpoint. So I think for us, the key really has been that just continue to listen to different things. We've run different pulse surveys during this entire time, and we've kept sort of quickly adapting. When we heard that parents are having a hard time, we even did some webinars for our parents, where they could get some expert help in terms of how do you manage this time emotionally in that sense. So different things during the pandemic, and I think from a inclusion standpoint, yes, I don't think anybody can replace the fact of being in the same space, and anybody I talk to, that's pretty much the first thing that comes to people's mind, that I miss having to go for a chai or a walk with a colleague, and I think that's the piece that we've not been able to replace. And yeah, but we've tried different things, especially on the issues that we heard, which is work-life balance, and we're still trying to solve it in all fairness, even with the initiatives that we've done. And yeah, so for us, it's been a journey of just listening and quickly adapting and doing what you can in that situation. And we are still learning.
Interesting, actually. So in fact, in our company also, something very similar happened. And one of the things that we started for parents was thrice in a week. We said in the morning we will do Gita sessions. And even today, for example, they started almost 3 months back, and they continue. And we have more than 500 people who log in every day, in every session. And people were thrilled because it actually takes their mind off everything else for that period, and then maybe whatever is discussed there helps them to think of life slightly differently. So yeah, of course, some of these are interesting things that people have tried to do. Yeah,
I
in
think
fact,
people discovering new things and new topics and new hobbies, and I think the traffic time that you spend in Bangalore, at least the 2 hours in the morning and 2 hours in the evening, is somewhat being better utilized.
So Anupam and I, we were actually discussing this before we started the webinar. We were talking about the fact that people, reconnected with their passions, and some people became so much entrepreneurial that they could monetize some of these passions. And that because people always tend to give a positive spin to what happens, and most of these actually were females because their expertise in cooking and their passion for baking, cooking, exotic recipes, or some of these things, they were able to actually help others. At the same time, they were able to monetize it. And what better opportunity to do that than some of these events there. So in fact, we've been talking a lot about workplace diversity, and we have been referring to work bias. Yeah.
Sorry, I just had a quick point, right? And this was, and I'm sorry, I'm going back to, the whole bias piece that we were discussing, right? And I just want to give a different, I did want to bring a different perspective there, because a lot of times when we speak about bias, everybody always looks at it from a very negative lens, right? Like the outcome of that is very negative. There's another reality in which bias shows up as well, and this is where I call it as positive bias, or this is where you try to be inclusive by being exclusive, which is, okay, this meeting is late at night, so I don't think she will be able to make it, or this person may not be able to make it, so let's not invite, or this job requires a lot of travel, so maybe let's have somebody else. Or this person is single, so let's actually ask this person to do this work because they might be happy to do this, right? So I also think that bias sometimes also comes up in very, very different ways, where it's supposed to be well-meaning, but it is still bias, and it ends up excluding a certain population. And I think especially when we start to talk about bias awareness, it's important to also bring these examples up to the fore as well, because these become very, very real situations for individuals.
Absolutely, Anupam, you actually touched upon a very
sorry, Pancham, I think when it comes to men as well, right? If somebody asks for example, a sabbatical because I need to take care of my kids at home, and the first question is, why do you need to take care of your kids at home? What does your wife do? Right? So I think men are equally to the bias, right? I mean, it's not gender specific in that sense.
You absolutely, and what you have touched upon is actually a very important workplace topic now. It's called microaggression. So these are small kinds of aggressive behaviors against a specific kind of people that normally are very nicely put, but they are very aggressive in nature. And when we talk about biasing and unbiasing, this is microaggression is certainly one of the topics that we always encourage that employers talk about. And in fact, that is the last survey, which will also, for example, help some of the people who have asked this question around workplace unbiasing. So participants, we will request you to go back to Menti and answer this question, the last question of the poll. We will just quickly summarize unbiasing using some of the things that we talked about, and then we will talk about how we could use some of these tools in our day-to-day lives to improve diversity and inclusiveness and a workplace which creates equal opportunities for everybody. Yeah, answers are now coming in. So the final score is an aggregate score. So interestingly, the lowest score is about a reward pattern. Interesting. Okay, training has now become the lowest score as people come in. Okay, interesting. Okay. Yeah, so broadly, at least one thing that stands out so far is that people are skewed on the left side of each of these. So clearly, I think this presents a huge opportunity for majority of the organizations to do a lot of work around unbiasing. I think when we are looking to look at some of the initiatives that we want to take towards creating a diverse and inclusive workplace, uh, unbiasing would be one of the first things that you may want to look at, because some people actually ask questions around how do we create a culture of unbiased, how do we train people on unbiasing. I think one of the first things is to look at how can we look at not only training people on the subject of biasing, but also how can I have a checklist, a bias checklist in each part of our people processes, which is for example, when we talk about hiring, can we do blind hiring, can we do blind performance management basis only the indicators for performance, and can we for example look at again rewards based on only roles and contribution, and can we issue job descriptions there that are free of gender or any kind of bias. For example, quite a few of these preferred is MBA from a premium institute is a bias about education institution, or he or she is required to, or he is required to do this, she is required to do this. So these are all examples of biased job descriptions. And for example, job will require working longer hours or high travel, therefore male candidates preferred. These are all examples of biased job descriptions, because you are creating that bias at the application stage itself. And last topic that we talked about is working on the team design that is inclusive and reduces bias. Here we are talking about not hiring clones of managers, but diverse views, diverse background, diverse thought, and also looking at a minimum size where you know that different opinions can be created which are not completely aligned. For example, a two people team or a three people team, a four people team or a five people team, therefore actually would give you more diverse viewpoints than that. Similarly, for interviewing, instead of one person interviewing, panel interviews of two or more than two people actually normally would be useful. So that's the kind of work that we are talking about when we look at team design for any work. So clearly there is an opportunity for many of the organizations to start working on this. Having said that, at this point, I also wanted to defer quickly to the last point to Anupam first and then Neha. So what are you doing in terms of unbiasing training? Because some people ask this question. It will be good to know your views. Anupam, what is Cisco doing in training people on unbiasing? And then Sneha will come to you.
So we obviously have a lot of, I would say, not just training material, but just also, so we have Degree as a learning platform that we use in the organization. So we actually have a full learning pathway, which includes reading material, which has training materials, etc., to create awareness around unconscious bias. I think the other one for us at Cisco is over the last year, we've been wanting our culture to shift to what we are calling a more conscious culture, which is people start to become more aware, not just within their teams, but also with respect to external communities as well. So what we've been doing is speaking about it. So it's not just a training, because I think just a training doesn't really create awareness, but there is a lot of leadership talk and reinforcement that comes right down from us to way below to all our execs and our leaders. There is education and training, and then of course we also use our EROs to hold up the mirror to all of us, to also speak about the experiences that they have or how life for them is. And so we have different platforms, different opportunities to create awareness around bias. For example, more recently, we have a network called Men for Inclusion, and we had a panel discussion, and we actually spoke about very, very real-time examples of bias that everybody, faces. So, for example, I shared the example when you are the only woman sometimes in a meeting, people look at you to take the minutes of the meeting. Or for example, if there's a team celebration that is happening, everybody looks at the women to either cut the cake or to order the food or to serve, etc. Right? So sometimes it's not even, I think it's just instinct. And so the minute we started to speak about some of this, a lot of people were like, oh my God, oh my God. And I think just talking sometimes creates awareness. And so I think there's no one way to create awareness. So we kind of looked at it from multiple different aspects.
Oh, great. Thanks, Anupam. So Sneha, you've been also talking about unconscious bias at workplace. So what is Myntra doing to help people become better managers of bias? Let's put it this way.
So a couple of things, Pancham. I think for us as well, awareness is really the first step. We've created these modules for all our managers, all our employees, which reflect on microaggressions, biases, what does non-inclusive behavior look like in a day-to-day life, from a day-to-day life point of view. And building on what Anupam said, I think it's a lot about the conversation as well, right? I mean, one is of course trainings and conversation that you can have, but I think what we have found is it's also useful to insert messages. So for example, I was sharing earlier before we got the session started, we got Kalki Kekle to talk about her experience as a woman in a parallel industry. What are the kind of biases that she has faced in her journey, and that connected and that clicked with a lot of people who were there on the call, and not just women, but men on the call as well, right? So I think some of those conversations helped. When it came to LGBT inclusion, we got people from the community to talk to our employees. And share their stories, share their journeys, and I think that builds empathy as well, because you are able to think and understand from another person's point of view as to how would they have felt in that scenario. While some of these nuances are difficult to understand as a third person as well, but at least it gives you a sense of what somebody else went through. So I think that's certainly one of the things that those are certainly things that we've been driving in terms of these conversations. I think what we are also trying is what you were referring to earlier in terms of the panel, the wisdom of the group, let's say. So all our performance conversations are driven through calibrations. For example, once the manager has rated, managers will get together and look at it from a peer standpoint as well, so that there's objectivity which is coming into it as well from a data standpoint, and we're not purely going by one person's subjective opinion of somebody's performance. Similarly, on interviews, we have a process wherein every interview is followed up by a debrief wherein everybody shares their perspective. And it's not necessarily the hiring manager or the manager who gets to take the call eventually. It's the wisdom of the group, which helps in unbiasing and pointing out some of the things which manager may be missing as well. In fact, whenever we do any of these calibration, we actually start with the list of biases so that it's also fresh in people's minds. We talk about recency bias, for example. And then during the place, if the HR moderator feels that, okay, this is where we are going with it, it's easier to call it out that, we spoke about recency bias, why are you talking about the past 3 months of performance, what happened during the rest of the year. So I think those are the pieces that we are trying to build in. Again, some of these are nudges, some of these are more process, training, etc., which comes into play as well. But like I said, I mean, this is a huge topic, right? I mean, and it needs a lot of fundamental mindset shifts as well, and those are the harder ones, because the challenge with unconscious bias is it is unconscious. You don't know that you're biased, right? And to bring people to a point wherein they're aware, blind spots are sort of uncovered. Yeah, it's a journey to make, and yeah, so we are on that journey. Hopefully, we can make more of a difference on that one as well.
Certainly, absolutely. Well, thanks a lot. So this brings us to the end of what we wanted to cover. I'll quickly take a minute to summarize what we talked about. So what we talked about is the fact that diversity and inclusion, while as a culture or as a society, India has always talked about Vasudhaiv Kutumbakam, which is like universe is my home. The fact is that it is not so simple when it comes to workplaces, and therefore we have to make concerted efforts to make sure that the workplace feels like inclusive workplace. Similarly, when we look at incorporating diversity and breaking stereotypes, there is a lot of concerted effort required there as well. And most of it has to be way of life. At the same time, it helps if we have some goals, and those goals have to be sponsored by all the leaders. It is not the job of only HR or a diversity leader. It is the job of all the line managers. It is the job of each employee. It is also important for us to reinforce some of these concepts through ongoing behavioral change interventions. It could be in the form of projects, learning interventions, trainings. We should certainly look at monitoring and measuring some of these things and reporting back, because that creates focus. At the same time, we should not limit ourselves to only metrics, but we should think of some of these initiatives as more than only metrics. And last but not the least, the starting journey happens to be around creating an unbiased workforce or workplace. And for that, people have to become aware of the biases, their own biases, and they have to learn to keep those biases aside, or they have to learn to manage them or minimize those in their decision making. Only then we will be able to create amazingly diverse and inclusive workplaces. Well, thanks a lot, Anupam. Thanks a lot, Sneha. I really had a good time looking at your perspective of what you guys are doing in your organization, and I thought it was amazing. I learned quite a few things, and I'm sure participants who were here and who had questions, they got some very specific answers, to the extent that they now have some policies that they can look at. They can look at some training programs. They can look at organizing certain forums, and I'm sure that is exactly what we wanted to do through Hangout Times Ascent. And thanks a lot. And thanks a lot, audience. You guys have been very, very participative. You guys have been sharing your perspective. That's awesome. And hopefully you've taken something that you can start working on starting tomorrow, or maybe today, depending on what time it is. Right. Thanks a lot. On that note, we will sign off.